Now that I have a VS Code project set up, I can show you how to compile some markdown code into a formatted document using the Quarto extension. If I open up my project folder, I'll find the file, the workspace file that I created with VS Code. And if I open up VS Code using that file, I'll be in the proper working directory for this project. So if you're going to use the Quarto extension, first of all, you need to install Quarto on your computer. That's a separate program that Visual Studio Code uses. And then in order for Visual Studio Code to use that program, you need to make sure you install the Quarto extension in Visual Studio Code. So this icon at the bottom here on the left is the extension manager for Visual Studio Code. And here you can find recommended programs or search for extensions. And here are the extensions I've already got installed. So I've got some extensions installed for using Python and also some extensions for using Jupyter Notebooks with Python. And finally, you'll see I have this Quarto extension. And that Quarto extension is what's going to allow me to use tools within Visual Studio to compile Markdown. So if I go back to my Explorer, before I can do anything, I need to create a Markdown file to compile. Right now, I just have a blank project. So if I right-click on Dimension, my project folder, I can create a new file in this folder. And this is going to be a text file. But it's going to be a text file with the MD extension, saying that it's a text file with Markdown inside that text file, Markdown code. Now you can tell that Visual Studio knows what that means, what that .md extension means at the end of this file name, because it put the icon for Markdown right next to it. As soon as I completed the .md extension, Visual Studio said, I know what that kind of file is, and I am going to call it a Markdown file. And indeed, when I hit enter after I've created this, it's going to bring up a text editor with the Markdown extension and the Markdown icon. And it knows that I'm trying to put Markdown into this file as an integrated development environment. So we need some Markdown to put in this file to play with. I'm going to bring up the web page and I'm going to grab the Markdown we've already created using R tools. Markdown is independent of R. This is Markdown. It doesn't really have anything to do with any sort of programming languages I might embed in it later. And I'm going to paste that here into this file. So if you recall, I have a YAML header here, and the YAML header is telling Quarto and ultimately Pandoc what the title of this document is. And then I have some Markdown code. Here's the first heading for a Darcy-Weisbach equation heading for the first section. And the content of that section is a description of the Darcy-Weisbach equation, including a list of variables in the equation and then the equation itself. Now, because I have the Quarto extension installed, I have one shortcut button here that I can use. This preview button furthest to the left was put here by the Quarto extension. And I simply need to click that, and it's going to allow me to preview this Markdown. So if I click on that button, it's going to pop up a terminal, and in that terminal, it's going to be running the Quarto preview function. And similar to R, that Quarto preview is going to create an HTML file in the working directory, and it's going to show me a view of that HTML file in an additional window here. Now, if I want to add something to this, I can say this is more material at the bottom, and I can click that preview button again, and it will compile the HTML again, and it will add that material in my preview. So let's minimize this. We can see when we created the Markdown file, it created a file in our working directory called dimension.md. And when I hit preview, it created this HTML, but it also created this dimension files folder. Now that's because by default, when Quarto creates HTML, it creates it without embedding all the materials directly in the HTML. There's some additional materials that have to be here with this HTML file in order to show us the formatted version of the HTML file. Now in R, if we, by default, when we create the HTML file, it fully embeds everything in the HTML. So this isn't doing anything wrong, it's just doing something different. Now if we want it to embed everything in the HTML, we can ask Quarto to do that using some more YAML settings. So in this case, we're going to add some YAML settings here. And I'm going to tell it that the format is HTML, and then the HTML setting for that format is to embed the resources. So I'm setting the embed resources value to true. And that's telling that when it creates an HTML file from this markdown that it should embed all the resources. So I'm going to close my preview window here. I'm going to close this terminal using Quarto Preview. I'm going to go ahead and delete these files just so you can see what happens, and we can try this again. Now, if I hit the preview, you might see the dimension files initially, but it's after it creates the embedded version of the HTML, that dimension files folder should disappear. So now I have a fully embedded version of this HTML, and you can see that I have it here in my preview. But I can also just look at that HTML by double clicking on it, and it should just pop up in my web browser as it has here. So that's the preview button, but there's also a way to use what's called the command palette. This little window at the top of VS Code is a way to access the command palette. And I can click on Show and Run Commands, and I can either start typing in a command here, like I know this command is going to start with Quarto, and it will filter out the commands to show me just the ones that start with Quarto. Or because I've been using Quarto recently, the most recent commands I've used are going to show up near the top. And you can see two different Quarto commands here in the command palette. There's one that says render document. There's also one down here that says preview. So preview is what I've been doing already. If I click this one, it's just going to do the same thing that I would do if I hit this button. But if I just want to render the document without a preview, I can click this button. And again, it will ask me which format I want to render to. Note that if you're in preview mode, it's going to render to HTML by default. But in this case, it asks me what format I want to render to. I'm going to click HTML. It brings up a Quarto render terminal here. So it brings up a new terminal and runs the Quarto render in it. Let's look at what it's running here. You'll see that it runs Quarto render, then the name of the file it's rendering, telling it to HTML. And then it says, well, I'm going to use pandoc to do this. So this is Quarto telling me that it's using pandoc to do this test. So just like in R, it ultimately used pandoc to do this job. Our markdown used, our studio used pandoc to do this job. In this case, that's also what Quarto is using. And again, you'll see that the HTML file is here as it has been rendered, and I can view it in a web browser simply by double clicking on it. So hopefully that will get you started if you want to work through the examples that I've went through with R, but you want to do it with Visual Studio and Quarto instead. Ultimately, in these materials, we'll be using Visual Studio Code and Quarto and provide some examples for how to embed Python code in the Markdown. And Quarto will handle how to execute that Python code and insert what comes out of the Python code back into the document. But we'll get into that later in the class.